Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are jumping headfirst into one of those really enduring debates, inequality. Is it just this unstoppable force always getting worse? Or, does the world somehow automatically sort itself out, find some kind of harmony?
Yeah, you hear those arguments all the time.
You do. And maybe you've even been in those conversations that feel less like a real dialogue and more like, well, what our source material actually calls a dialogue of the deaf.
Right, where people kind of use the complexity maybe to just not dig too deep.
Exactly, to justify sort of not thinking too hard. So our mission today in this deep dive is really to try and cut through some of that noise.
Okay.
We're going to ground ourselves in systematic, methodical research, historical facts. It's drawn from this incredible body of work, especially by Thomas Piketty, that forms the backbone of our sources.
And this isn't just abstract theory, plucked from nowhere. This research goes deep into the actual dynamics, how wealth is distributed across countries over centuries.
Centuries.
Yeah, using these amazing historical data sets, things like Parisian estate records.
Wow.
Going all the way back to the French Revolution, or, detailed tax data from lots of different nations.
The goal here really is clarity, to try and understand the real patterns, the actual economic and social engines driving these things, and hopefully help focus the conversation on the right questions, the ones that actually matter for democratic societies trying to grapple with inequality. Let's maybe start by unpacking the challenge itself.
Well, studying distribution, it's not like physics, is it? It's really hard to do systematically.
Wow.
If you don't have precisely defined sources, methods, concepts, well, it's easy to see whatever you want to see, or the opposite.
But the researcher behind this work, they're pretty upfront about it. Social science is tentative, it's imperfect.
Definitely.
But, and this is crucial, he argues, it's really the best tool we have to inform that democratic debate, to peel back layers of preconceived ideas or even, frankly, misleading stuff.
By patiently, painstakingly looking for the facts, the patterns.
That patience, it seems key. You mentioned the source mentioned a personal journey into this research, starting with those Parisian estate records.
Yeah, that's right. Imagine digging through centuries of documents, just detailing who owned what when they died.
This sounds fascinating.
It gives you this incredibly intimate, granular view of just how significant wealth was in people's lives, and also the sheer difficulty in actually measuring it accurately over these huge stretches of time.
Makes the abstract numbers feel very, very human, I suppose.
Exactly.
Now, before we get totally lost in the data, the source takes us on a quick tour of some economic heavyweights from the past.
Right.
Thinkers who wrestled with inequality. And it offers some maybe surprising critiques of their famous predictions.
Yeah, let's start with David Ricardo, early 19th century.
Okay.
He had this scarcity principle, basically predicting a pretty grim future where landowners would just kind of gobble up all the economic gains.
Pushing wages down.
Yeah, pushing workers' wages down to bare subsistence levels.
The classic Malthusian trap idea. But that didn't quite happen like that, did it?
No, not exactly. What actually happened, which Ricardo didn't fully see coming, is that wages did eventually start to increase quite significantly.
When was that?
Starting in the late 19th century. And that really fundamentally changed the landscape for workers, even though, huge inequality still existed.
Okay, so Ricardo's dark prophecy wasn't fully realized. Then came Karl Marx, later in the 19th century.
Right. His vision was one of relentless, infinite accumulation of capital.
Leading inevitably to collapse.
That was the idea. And like Ricardo's, his darkest predictions didn't fully play out either, at least not in the advanced capitalist countries he was mainly looking at.
Why not? What did he miss?
Well, the research suggests a couple of things. Marx, maybe understandably for his time, didn't fully account for the potential of sustained technological progress.
And productivity growth.
Exactly. Those acted as counterweights to just pure capital accumulation. Plus, he worked with very little actual statistical data.
Really?
Yeah, which the author speculates might have led him to kind of solidify his conclusions before really testing them against historical facts.
And the source also notes he notoriously didn't spend much time thinking about what a society without private capital would actually look like, politically or economically.
Right, which the source dryly notes led to some tragic totalitarian experiments.
Understatement, perhaps. A significant oversight, yeah.
With profound consequences. Okay, so fast forward to the mid-20th century. Now you get Simon Kuznets.
And a much sunnier outlook.
Much sunnier. This was the famous Kuznets curve theory.
The idea that inequality just automatically goes down as a country gets richer, more industrialized.
That's the one. He based it on U.S. data from 1913 to 1948, a period when U.S. inequality was decreasing.
Huh.
But the source calls this theorizing highly speculative. Even notes that Kuznets himself actually had some reservations.
But it did took off.
Oh, it became incredibly powerful, especially politically. Think about the Cold War context.
Ah, okay. How so?
It was used as this powerful weapon, essentially, to tell developing countries, look, stick with capitalism. Inequality will sort itself out naturally as you grow. Don't even think about the communist alternative.
Wow. So keep them within the orbit of the free world, as the source puts it.
Precisely. What looked like this natural economic law was actually being deployed as a political argument.
That's fascinating.
And the research argues that this whole era, Kuznets' optimism, combined with, frankly, an undue enthusiasm for simplistic mathematical models.
Models that didn't really fit history.
Right. It led economists to basically stop studying the distribution of wealth seriously for decades. They kind of dropped the big, tough questions the 19th century thinkers had been asking.
Which just highlights why getting back to solid historical data is so critical for this research we're discussing.
Absolutely. You can't understand the long sweep, the real trends, without the numbers. And that meant going back and really digging.
So what kind of data are we talking about mainly?
The study draws heavily on a few core types. Estate tax returns are a huge one.
Because they go back further.
Exactly. People have taxed inheritances in some form or another for a very long time. These records often go way back 19th century, sometimes even earlier.
Like in France.
Yeah, that allowed for groundbreaking work on France since the Revolution. And also really detailed studies on the UK, Sweden.
And then income tax returns fill in the more recent picture.
Right, roughly from 1900 onwards. Now, it's important to say the data isn't, perfect or globally uniform.
No, I guess not.
It's vastly better for rich countries. So the historical story in the book, it does lean heavily on the experience of places like the U.S., Japan, Germany, France, Great Britain.
Okay.
Though they've made real efforts to bring in data from emerging countries, too, using things like the World Top Incomes database.
Right. So we're getting a clearer view of some parts of the world history than others, but it's all built on these, tangible historical records.
That's the foundation.
Okay. Before we dive into the patterns themselves, let's quickly define a couple of key terms this research uses all the time.
Good idea. Absolutely essential. First up, national income.
Okay.
Think of this as the total pie of money available to everyone living in a country in a given year. So wages, profits, rent, everything.
Is it the same as GDP?
Similar, but slightly different. It accounts for depreciation, the wear and tear on capital assets. GDP doesn't subtract that.
Got it. So what's the rough size of that pie today per person in wealthy countries?
In round numbers, maybe around 30,000 per person per year, or about 2,500 a month.
Okay.
But the research immediately stresses that this average figure hides truly enormous disparities.
Right. The average isn't what most people actually experience.
No.
Okay. Second big term, national wealth, sometimes called capital.
Right. This is the total stock of non-human assets, things that can be owned and traded.
Like land, buildings.
Exactly. Land, buildings, machinery, infrastructure, patents, financial assets like stocks and bonds, the market value of companies.
Okay. Does it include skills or education? Human capital?
No. The research is very explicit. It excludes human capital. National wealth is simply the sum of private wealth and public wealth.
Public wealth being things the government owns, like parks or maybe state-owned companies.
Precisely. But interestingly, in most developed countries today, public wealth is often quite small, sometimes zero or even negative because of public debt.
So national wealth is mostly private wealth then?
Overwhelmingly, yes. And even intangible things like a company's brand value, they often get captured within the stock market capitalization of corporations, which is part of that private wealth.
Okay, got it. Income is the flow, capital or wealth is the stock.
Yeah.
Now, these concepts are linked by what the source calls the first fundamental law of capitalism.
Yeah, and this one is actually just an accounting identity. It's true by definition. It's out it goes, RIA boy.
Alpha equals R times beta. Okay, break that down.
So alpha OS is capital share of national income, the slice of the pie that goes to owners of capital as opposed to labor. R is the average rate of return on that capital, what it earns each year.
Right.
And beta is the crucial capital income ratio. It's the total value of all the capital stock divided by the national income. Essentially, how many years of national income the total capital stock is worth.
Okay, let me see if I get this. If a country's total capital is worth, say, 6 years of its income, so it'd be 6.
Yeah.
And if that capital earns an average return of 5% a year, so or is 0.05, then capital share of income has to be 30%, 0.05 times 6.
Exactly. It's just how the numbers have to relate at any given point in time. It's a snapshot.
Okay, that makes sense. The second law is different, though. More about dynamics.
Yes. The second fundamental law of capitalism. This one describes a long-term tendency. It's more of an equilibrium idea.
Which is
Beta
equals S divided by G.
Right. The capital income ratio will tend over the long run to equal the net savings rate, S divided by the growth rate of the economy.
Okay, so if people save a lot, high S, but the economy isn't growing very fast, low G,
Yeah.
then the ratio of capital to income will tend to get bigger. You're building up capital faster than income is growing.
That's the core dynamic it captures. If S is high and G is low, bet tends to rise. If G is high relative to S, bet tends to fall or stabilize.
Interesting.
But, and this is important, the research adds caveats. It's a tendency, right? Not some iron law that's always perfectly true at every moment.
Okay.
It mainly applies to the kind of capital you can save and accumulate. And, critically, it assumes relative asset prices like housing prices versus other prices are stable in the long run.
Which they aren't always.
Exactly. In reality, short-term swings in asset prices, like a huge housing boom or a stock market crash, can totally swamp the effects of the savings rate on beta.
That nuance feels really important.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have the definitions, we have the two laws. What does all that painstaking historical data actually show about how capital, income, and inequality have moved over time?
Well, the data on the capital income ratio across developed countries shows something pretty dramatic, especially in Europe.
What's that?
It's a distinct U-shaped curve over the 20th century.
Tell me more.
Okay, picture this. Beta is incredibly high around the year 1900. Think maybe 6 or even 7 years of national income tied up in capital. Huge stock of wealth relative to income.
Wow.
Then, between roughly 1914 and 1945, there's this massive, sharp drop.
The wars.
The wars were huge. Destruction of physical capital, inflation wiping out financial wealth, governments nationalizing industries, low savings during really tough economic times. It all pushed way down.
So war and chaos destroyed capital, essentially. It wasn't some gentle decline.
Not at all. It was violent shocks. But then, from the 1970s or so onwards, the bottom of that U starts to curve back up. Beta starts climbing significantly again, heading back towards those really high levels seen in the early 20th century.
So that mid-20th century period, the Trente Glorieuses in France, the post-war boom, the time many people might think of as sort of normal capitalism. That was actually the bottom of this long U. Kind of an anomaly in terms of capital's relative size.
That's exactly what the European data suggests, and it might explain why some U.S.-centric economic textbooks maybe missed this bigger picture.
Because the U.S. had a less dramatic U.
A much shallower U-shape, yes. So they might have just assumed DFIS is naturally kind of stable.
Interesting. And looking ahead, what does the model suggest?
Well, looking forward, based on plausible future trends, like, say, a global savings rate staying around 10%, but growth slowing down to maybe 1.5% a year later in the 21st century.
Right.
That second law, DBE, suggests it could reach 700% globally.
7 years.
7 years of global income represented by the capital stock.
Wow. Okay, so if DFIF follows this U-shape, what about alpha?
Yeah.
Capital share of income. Does that follow suit?
It does, largely because of that first law, Osove. When a DFIS was high in the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe, OSA was also estimated to be quite high.
How high?
Maybe 35–40% of national income going to capital, and land rents alone were a huge chunk of that, maybe 20% of national income just from rent.
Incredible.
And just as Boone has been rising again since the 1970s, Ein is also rising again, especially if the rate of return on capital stays relatively high.
Which brings us to that rate of return. What does the data show about that, historically and today?
Historically, average rates seem to have often been around 4–5% before taxes.
Okay.
Today, the after-tax return is generally lower, partly because we have significant taxes on capital income. Now, rich countries average about a 30% tax rate, maybe?
So capital owners take home less net return today than, say, 150 years ago, on average.
On average, yes. But Here's perhaps the most surprising and maybe the most important single finding from this whole body of research.
Okay.
It's about how R seems to change based on the size of the capital you hold.
Ah, it's not the same for everyone.
That's the crucial insight. The data strongly suggests that the rate of return often increases significantly with the size of the fortune or the endowment.
How do they show that?
The research uses this really compelling example of university endowments.
Like Harvard, Yale, those big...
Exactly. The very largest endowments, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, they have consistently achieved much higher average annual returns over decades.
Higher than smaller universities.
Much higher. Often 7–10% or even more, before fees maybe, but still significantly higher net returns than smaller endowments, which might get 5–6%.
And much higher than what a typical household gets on their savings.
Way higher. The average return on all private wealth held by typical households might be closer to 3–4% after tax and inflation.
So wait, it's not just that having a big fortune means you get more money in absolute terms.
Right.
Your big fortune actually grows faster, percentage-wise, than a smaller one.
That's what the data indicates, yes. And think about what that means when R, especially the earned by very large fortunes, is significantly higher than the overall economic growth rate.
It creates this engine for divergence.
Exactly. A powerful force pushing inequality wider and wider, which leads us directly to the data on the inequality of wealth itself.
And the historical picture here is pretty stark, right? Thinking 18th, 19th century Europe.
Extremely stark, incredibly concentrated. You had the top 10% of the population owning something like 90% of the total wealth.
90% for the top 10th.
And within that, the top 1% often owned 50% or even more of everything.
That's the world we read about in Jane Austen or Balzac, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Where inheriting wealth was basically the only game in town if you wanted to be really rich.
Absolutely. Accumulated inherited wealth wasn't just important, it was the defining feature of the economic hierarchy in those societies.
Right.
And the research really hammers this point home. The reason that extreme concentration fell so dramatically in the 20th century, especially after 1914,
There wasn't progress.
it was not because societies just spontaneously became more equal or fair.
It was the shocks again.
It was the shocks. It was the literal and financial destruction of war, combined with inflation, wiping out fortunes, state expropriations, bankruptcies. That's what dramatically reduced the value and concentration of that previously accumulated wealth.
Not some gentle, harmonious evolution.
No, it was brutal disruption.
And now, since the 1970s or 80s, that concentration is rising again.
Yes. And the research finds no, quote, natural, spontaneous process inherent in market economies that will necessarily stop it from returning to those extreme Belle Epoque levels.
Especially if growth stays low and R stays high.
Particularly then. If G is low and R, especially the R on large fortunes, stays significantly higher than G, the math points towards increasing concentration.
Okay, so that's wealth inequality. What about the money people earn from working?
Yeah.
The inequality of labor income.
Right, so the distribution of wages and salaries. This shows a different pattern and also really interesting variations between countries, which the source highlights.
Like where?
Think about Scandinavia, particularly between, say, 1970 and 1990. They were the most equal in terms of wages.
Oh, equal.
The top 10% of wage earners got only about 20% of the total wage bill, while the bottom 50% of workers received about 35% of all wages.
Wow, so the bottom half took home significantly more of the total wage pie than the top 10th did. A very compressed distribution.
Very compressed. Now, contrast that with the European average today. It's more spread out. Top 10% gets maybe 25–30% of wages. Bottom 50% gets around 30%.
More unequal, but still fairly close.
Yeah. And then you look at the U.S., especially in the early 2010s data presented in the source. It's shown as the most unequal among the rich countries studied.
What did the distribution look like?
In the U.S., the top 10% of earners get about 35% of total wages, while the bottom 50% received only about 25%.
So it's basically flipped compared to Scandinavia. The bottom half gets substantially less than the top 10th.
Exactly, an inverted picture.
And the source really zeroes in on where that increase in U.S. wage inequality is happening, doesn't it? It's not across the board.
Not at all. It's hyper-concentrated at the very, very top.
It's super managers.
That's the term used, yeah. The pay for the top 1%, and even more dramatically the top 0.1%, has just seen this explosive increase. Far, far outpacing wage growth, even for other high earners, say, in the rest of the top 10%.
And the research questions whether standard economics can explain that.
It raises a fundamental question. Can standard economic theory, like marginal productivity theory, where pay supposedly equals your contribution, really account for this extreme surge right at the peak. It suggests other factors might be much more important than often admitted, things like bargaining power, shifts in social norms about executive pay.
So maybe not purely about individual merit or productivity driving those huge numbers.
The source casts doubt on that being the sole explanation, yes. And it also points to the role of institution.
Like minimum wages.
Things like minimum wage laws, yes, or established wage scales within companies or whole sectors. These aren't just background noise. They are active policy choices and historical structures that can significantly shape how that total wage pie gets divided up.
Right, independent of just abstract economic models.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've traced this U-shape of capital, the power of R, especially for the wealthy, the shocks that temporarily reduced wealth concentration, and its current rise. Plus, these different patterns in labor income inequality. All of this seems to point towards another core finding, the significant return of inheritance.
Yes, inherited wealth was, as we said, absolutely fundamental to the structure of 18th and 19th century European society, foundational to that extreme wealth concentration.
And it declined in the 20th century.
Its importance declined hugely, yeah. Partly because of those violent shocks destroying old fortunes, and partly because, for a while, labor income grew faster and became relatively more important during the post-war boom years.
But the data suggests it's making a comeback.
A really significant one. It's particularly visible in Europe. The simulations presented for France, for example, are quite striking.
What do they show?
They show inherited wealth share of total national wealth plummeting during the 20th century, but potentially returning to 19th century levels in the 21st century.
What kind of levels are we talking?
Meaning maybe 80% or even 90% of total wealth could eventually be accounted for by wealth that was inherited or accumulated from savings out of past inherited wealth.
80 to 90%. That sounds like a society primarily built on inherited capital again, much like centuries ago.
It fundamentally changes the picture of who owns what and why they own it. And again, this is strongly linked to that dynamic where R tends to exceed G.
And the research also notes a rise in gift giving, people passing wealth down while alive.
Yes, a noticeable increase since the 1970s, potentially linked to people living longer, maybe parents wanting to help children earlier in life. It's part of this broader trend of wealth transmission becoming more important.
How does this compare to the modern image we have of wealth creation? You know, the entrepreneurs, the tech billionaires, the self-made story.
The source directly contrasts them. It uses examples like Bill Gates versus Lillian Bettencourt, the L'Oreal heiress, and it finds both saw their fortunes grow incredibly rapidly between 1990 and 2010. Both achieved very high returns, actually over 10% annually in real terms during that period.
So entrepreneurial fortunes can certainly grow very fast.
Absolutely. But the research makes a crucial point. Inherited wealth is often much harder to track. It tends to be more diversified, less visible.
Less tied to one famous company founder.
Exactly. And so it's frequently underestimated in those public rankings, like the Forbes lists, which tend to focus on founders or people with very clear corporate affiliations. Inherited fortunes might fly under the radar more, but the evidence suggests they are growing significantly and are poised to become increasingly dominant in the overall structure of wealth.
So our public image of who the wealthy are might be kind of skewed, even as inherited wealth quietly retakes center stage.
That's a key argument, yes.
This brings us to maybe the biggest factor influencing all these dynamics, historically and today. Policy. Politics. The state. The 20th century saw just a massive transformation in the role of the state, didn't it?
With a totally unprecedented shift. Think about taxes. Before World War I, total tax receipts in wealthy countries were typically less than 10% of national income.
Tiny by today's standards.
Tiny. By the late 20th century, that figure had exploded. It was somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of national income being collected in taxes.
This wasn't just about the government taking more money, right? It enabled huge social changes.
Absolutely. This fiscal revolution, as the source calls it, funded actual social revolutions. Public pensions were introduced.
Which basically ended widespread old age poverty.
Pretty much, yeah. Elderly poverty was still common even in the 1950s. Then there was the huge expansion of access to public health care, public education. The state's footprint in the economy today is historically enormous.
And how specifically did taxation policy try to manage or rein in inequality during that period?
Well, the early 20th century saw the emergence of two key tools. The progressive income tax.
Where higher incomes pay a higher rate.
Exactly. And the progressive inheritance tax. Often, their introduction or sharp increase was driven by the desperate need to fund the world wars.
Right.
And the research points to a really clear correlation later on. Look at the period since 1980. The countries that saw the largest decreases in their top marginal income tax rates.
So cutting taxes the most for the highest earners.
Yes. Those are precisely the countries where the share of national income going to those very top earners has increased the most.
Wow. So tax less at the top slice of the income pie grows faster? That's a pretty powerful correlation.
The data shows a very strong link, yes. However, implementing effective taxation today, especially on capital, faces some really big challenges.
Capital's mobile now.
Much more mobile. And tax havens. They are a major, major obstacle. Mobile capital and the existence of these havens severely limit what individual national governments can achieve on their own with tax policy.
It undermines their efforts.
Definitely. The source gives examples like Italy having trouble effectively taxing financial assets held by its citizens, or Greece struggling to tax wealthy people who can just easily move their money abroad.
Sounds like a potential race to the bottom, or at least a serious constraint on national choices.
It fundamentally weakens the ability of countries to use the kind of progressive taxation measures that historically helped keep inequality in check.
So what's the solution proposed?
Well, the research argues strongly that effective solutions really require international cooperation.
Like countries working together.
Yes. Specifically, it calls for things like automatic sharing of bank information between countries, creating essentially a global financial cadastre, like a land registry, but for financial assets.
To make wealth visible.
Exactly, to bring hidden wealth out of the shadows and into the light of democratic scrutiny. And then, looking further ahead, as a long-term ideal, maybe utopian, the source admits, but worth considering.
What is it?
The idea of a progressive global tax on capital.
A global wealth tax.
Yeah.
Wow, that sounds incredibly ambitious. How would that work?
The basic idea is you tax net wealth, so assets minus debts annually, and the tax rate would be progressive, meaning it increases with the size of the fortune.
Higher rates on bigger fortunes.
Right. And the justification for potentially quite high rates on the very largest fortunes isn't just about abstract fairness. It links directly back to that finding about R.
That bigger fortunes earn higher returns.
Exactly. The source suggests that significantly higher tax rates might be justifiable for fortunes over, say, 100 million or €1 billion, precisely because those fortunes tend to generate returns of 6–7% or even higher. It's proposed as a way to counteract that powerful RG divergence dynamic at the very top.
It's a direct policy response to that core finding.
Interesting. What about public debt?
Yeah.
You often hear arguments that countries should just sell off state assets to pay down their debts.
The source discusses that idea and largely dismisses it. It argues that essential public services often depend on the continued public ownership of the related assets, think infrastructure, maybe public lands.
Right. It also touches briefly on the evolution of central banks. How they learned, especially after the trauma of the Great Depression, where conservative policies made things worse, to act as lenders of last resort to prevent financial collapse.
A big shift in their role.
A fundamental shift. And there's also a bit of a critique in the source regarding current supranational governance structures like the Eurozone.
What's the criticism there?
Basically that they often lack democratic transparency and accountability. Important decisions about budgets or how to handle crises get made in closed-door meetings of councils, rather than through open, sovereign, public debate suitable for the 21st century.
Okay, there is. Wow, there is a lot packed into this research. So if we try to boil it down, what are the really key takeaways? Why does this matter to you, listening right now?
I think the core message is that there's nothing automatic, nothing natural that guarantees inequality will decrease or stabilize.
It doesn't just sort itself out.
No. The powerful forces that drive divergence, especially the way capital accumulates, and that tendency for R to exceed G, particularly for large fortunes, those forces can absolutely prevail, maybe even permanently, unless they're deliberately countered by other forces or policies.
We have forces for convergence too, right? Like knowledge spreading.
Yes, absolutely. The diffusion of knowledge, skills, education, those are powerful forces for convergence. But the point is they aren't guaranteed to win out against the forces of divergence. It's a constant tension.
And this whole picture directly challenges a really core idea that many democratic societies hold dear, doesn't it? The idea of meritocracy.
It really does. Democratic societies often operate on the hope, maybe even the explicit promise, that success and therefore inequality is primarily based on individual merit, talent, effort, hard work.
Not just who your parents are.
Exactly, not based on kinship or rents or inherited wealth. But this research highlights this deep tension between the equality of rights we have on paper and the very real and potentially growing inequality of actual living conditions.
And the potential return of inherited wealth to center stage really shakes that meritocratic ideal.
Fundamentally, if most significant wealth comes from inheritance rather than effort, what does that do to the social contract?
Right. So this research, it's not presented as like the final word, the absolute truth.
Oh, far from it. And the source itself is very clear about this. Social science is tentative, it's always evolving, it's imperfect.
Okay.
But the goal here is to provide a much more solid foundation based on facts, based on historical patterns, rather than just opinion or ideology alone. The aim is to inform and hopefully improve that essential democratic debate we need to have about inequality.
And understanding goes beyond just looking at abstract numbers, like a Gini coefficient.
Yeah, the source really emphasizes the value of looking at concrete data, distribution tables, seeing where different groups actually sit in the hierarchy, the bottom 50%, the middle 40%, the top 10%, the top 1%,
Really grasp the reality.
to grasp the reality of social inequality. Yeah. And maybe even figure out, where you yourself fit into that picture. It makes the abstract feel much more tangible and personal.
So this deep dive into the source material, it really reveals that these dynamics of wealth and income inequality, they're driven by identifiable forces.
The rate of return on capital versus the growth rate, savings rates, those big historical shocks, and critically, policy choices.
And the historical data uncovers these really surprising patterns. That U-shaped comeback of capital,
Yeah.
the potential revival of inherited wealth as a dominant force.
Yeah, things that maybe weren't obvious without looking at the long run. And it powerfully underscores that the collective decisions we make through the political process, especially around things like taxation and regulation,
They matter hugely.
they have historically been and they remain absolutely central to shaping how wealth and income get distributed in our societies.
It really leaves us with a thought-provoking question, doesn't it? Straight from the heart of this research. If our democratic societies fundamentally rely on this hope, this ideal, that inequality is based on merit rather than inherited wealth, what does it actually mean politically, socially, economically, if inherited wealth appears poised to become as dominant, maybe, as it was in the world described by Austin and Balzac?
It's a huge question.
It's certainly a question worth keeping in mind.